Welcome back, everyone, online and on site. We hope everybody had a good lunch. We had a pretty good lunch here. Unfortunately, the person who's supposed to be moderating this part had an allergic reaction to the sandwich that she had at lunch. So if you will please keep Reverend Leslie Dotson in your prayers as she has gone to get Benadryl or whatever, and she will be back with us later. But for now, fortunately, it's me again. Now that I've got the system down, maybe I'll do even better for you, Reverend Joshua Shawnee. We are so glad that you're here. We are looking forward to what you have to share with us. We know we will be challenged. We know we will learn. And most of all, we know that you will offer us grace as we all offer it to each other. So.
Good afternoon. I hope we all had a good lunch today. I'll do my best to talk quietly so you can nap freely and not be interrupted today. It is an honor to be with you today. Like she said, my name is Joshua Shawnee. I'm blessed to serve as a pastor and parish priest of the Parish Church of St. Jerome here in Tulsa. The Parish Church of St. Jerome is an oddity. It is an independent and inclusive and affirming and women ordaining Catholic community that is celebrating 29 years. So excited to be part of that community. I'm also the elected vicar general of the Society of Mercy, my religious community. I also serve as the director of education and social services for the Shawnee tribe. And because I'm a Catholic and we're really into suffering in my free time, I'm pursuing a PhD at Kairos University where I study ethnohermeneutics. And ethnohermeneutics is the intersection of ethnohistory and cultural anthropology and biblical and theological studies. My research focuses on the native experience of Christianization, colonization, and its history and its lived expression in modernity. Anytime I speak, I like to offer a few quick housekeeping matters, some things to contextualize our time here together today. As you may have guessed, given my last name, I am Shawnee and Delaware, and I'm proud to be an enrolled citizen of the Shawnee tribe. I want to name here at the outset, however, that I do not speak on behalf of all Native Americans today. I speak only from my particular tribal background, also from my particular clan, and my particular granular experience within my family kinship circle. I cannot speak today on behalf of even the Shawnee tribe, let alone all Native Americans. For instance, I cannot speak authoritatively on the Indian experience of Christianization and colonization because even among the Shawnee peoples, the Shawnee tribe, the absentee Shawnee, the Eastern Shawnee, we all experience colonization and Christianization differently. I cannot teach you about the Native American theology or cosmology because the Native experience or understanding of anything simply doesn't exist. The worldviews and lifeways of the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest are demonstrably different from the great Southwestern tribes who cosmologically diverge and ceremonially break away from the tribes originating up around the Great Lakes. I want to name and honor that reality, that the Native peoples in North America hold a dizzying array of worldviews, ceremonial practices, lifeways, cultures, kinship structures, and languages that popular culture has homogenized into a vague pan-Indianism that is as patronizing as it is reductive. So let's work together this week to think, talk about Native persons, communities, and experiences in ways that honor their uniqueness, their nuanced complexity, and their continuing agency as living, breathing communities in our midst today. Native peoples, thank God, were not lost to history. They exist today as sovereign nations even now, and attempts to generalize or tokenize or historicize them can only hinder our great work of advocating for justice fostering reconciliation and building the Creator's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Thank you for joining me this week in this great and important work. Now, I mentioned that my ongoing doctoral work is in ethnohermeneutics, particularly in the indigenous experience of Christianization and colonization in what we call Native North America. When Dr. Barnett kindly invited me to speak today on the theme of incursion, I thought immediately about the experience of our Two-Spirit and indigiqueer brothers, sisters, kin. Not only is this a particular research interest of mine, the Two-Spirit and indigiqueer experience of Western incursion really exemplifies in many ways the themes and the movements that we'll explore over the next few days. So I'd like to begin by exploring a history that may be very unfamiliar to most of us, that Two-Spirit history. Two-Spirit history, indigiqueer history, is a silent history. It survives only in a fragmentary way in the written historical record, because Two-Spirit and indigiqueer history has been silenced by the incursion of colonizing and Christianizing forces for centuries. But still it lives on. It lives on in the experiences of Two-Spirit and indigiqueer persons and communities and their allies. It lives on despite the sustained systemic violence and intentional erasure. It lives on despite this silence. So I'd like to spend some time today and tomorrow seeking to end that silence. I'd like to celebrate that living history by giving voice to the narratives, stories, and experiences missing from our social and ecclesial histories, by mining that historical record for external evidence of Two-Spirit and indigiqueer experiences and identities in antiquity. A record that demonstrates that not only do the Two-Spirit and indigiqueer identities and persons exist in a sustained and widespread fashion prior to colonization, but that the decline and near annihilation of Two-Spirit and indigiqueer identities within a native cultural context was intrinsically related to the indigenous experience of Christianization. Today, we'll delve into Two-Spirit and indigiqueer identities as experienced and expressed within our contemporary era, tomorrow we will, focusing on an in-depth analysis of three oral history interviews. We'll explore the religious histories, coming to terms and coming out experiences, and hopes for the future of three Two-Spirit and indigiqueer elders, providing us with a poignant glimpse of the strength and courage and tenacity of our Two-Spirit and indigiqueer brothers, sisters, kin, both in history and in modernity. It's hoped that our time together this next few days will be good medicine, that it will be the Two-Spirit medicine we so desperately need for the healing not only of indigenous communities, but also for the healing, reconciliation, and restoration of both the colonized and the colonizing throughout history and around the world. All good healing journeys start with a story. Let's get back to that Two-Spirit story. In exploring the academic literature for references to Two-Spirit and indigiqueer persons and identities, especially within a Western textual resource context, researchers are confronted with a word that may be unfamiliar to us, and that word is berdache. In a note on berdache, scholars Henry Angelino and Charles Shedd maintain that in the literature, the term berdache has been used in an exceedingly ambiguous way. They observe, etymologically speaking, berdache is derived from the French word bardage, which is derived from the Arabic bardage, which is derived from the Persian bara, and it initially meant a kept boy or a male prostitute or a catamite, but it came to be appropriated by these early French trappers and explorers to refer disparagingly to indigenous persons who were passive homosexuals, or specifically those individuals who played a passive role to sodomy. Over time, berdache came to serve as a comprehensive placeholder term for what the authors termed homosexualism, hermaphroditism, transvestism, and effeminism. Most all of the persons on that Two-Spirit and indigiqueer spectrum, including those who were, quote, married to individuals of the same physiological sex, and natives, male or female, who, while still young, assumed the dress and habits of the opposite sex and retained them throughout their lives. End quote. Berdache then is the term most often used to denote two-spirit and indigiqueer persons and identities in the 19th and 20th centuries. In wrestling with the term Berdache and other words or phrases used to describe two-spirit and indigiqueer experiences, anthropologist Carolyn Epple proffers in Coming to Terms that attempts to control the vocabulary or to reduce it to a single synthesized term are problematic because they ignore the great variability across Native American cultures, thereby minimizing and approximating simultaneous distinctiveness and fluidity within Indigenous conceptions of sexuality and gender identity, conceptions that require deep cultural contextualization to truly understand. Put simply, any word or phrase we use to qualify or quantify or simplify these clear expressions of gender identity and sexual orientation in Native America cannot possibly encompass or encapsulate the vast array of gender identities and sexualities expressed in Indigenous communities prior to colonization, or the myriad amorphous forms these identities and orientations took across the complex, diverse, nuanced spectrum of federations, tribal communities, clans, and kinship circles that constitute Native America in history and in modernity. She states, quote, "The terms Berdache, alternate gender, gay, or two-spirit are clearly inadequate, shortcoming, I suspect, stemming from the continued uncritical reliance on unexamined Western assumptions about the centrality of gender and sexual practices. Sexual practices, for example, are often described in terms of asexuality, a modern invention. Thus, one could legitimately question the significance of sexual practices so construed for cultures with different historical constructions of identity and the individual. Concept of gender practices is no less problematic. The supposed discovery of third or fourth or even more genders reifies the binary opposition of man and woman rather than disrupting it, and imposes gender constructs that may be inapplicable in Native contexts." End quote. For this reason, I embrace the terms two-spirit and indigiqueer, acknowledging that while even these terms are rooted in contemporary Western conceptions of sexuality and gender, it's hoped that the composite phrase two-spirit and indigiqueer will at least allow for a greater expression of the vast spectrum of sexualities and gender identities experienced and expressed in Native America, both in modernity and in antiquity. The phrase two-spirit and indigiqueer is not meant to be categorical or descriptive, but rather it's a necessary placeholder phrase for what cannot truly be expressed or understood outside of a communal indigenous context or cosmology. Now, it's important to note at the outset that two-spirit and indigiqueer identities and orientations were not isolated phenomena, particular to a few tribal communities. The existence of two-spirit and indigiqueer persons is as widespread as it is well documented. In The Institution of Berdache among the North American Plains Indians, David Forgy observes that the institution of Berdache was widespread among the Plains tribes, having been reported among the Assiniboine, the Dakota, the Plains Cree, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Crow, the Mandan, the Hadasta, the Omaha, the Caddo, and the Pawnee. Forgy reports that attitudes toward the Berdache ranged from a quiet tolerance, as among the Sioux, to a positive one of great esteem among the Cheyenne. In many tribes, these persons were said to have a place within their indigenous societies and cultures ordained by divine mandate. Hence, no stigma was attached to these individuals, whose place within their community was understood as sacred, their position having been supernaturally dictated. Anthropologists Charles Callender and Lee M. Kokums confirmed this in the North American Berdache. They put forth that even with scanty and fragmentary and unsatisfactory data within the textual record, there is, quote, reasonably good evidence, that's how sociologists speak, for the existence of Bardash among 113 tribal groups, from California to the Mississippi Valley and the upper Great Lakes, with scattered occurrences beyond. As a side note, to go off script a little bit, the only areas that we don't have any textual evidence of the existence of Two-Spirit and indigenous peoples is anywhere east of the Mississippi. Think about what happened there first. Contact, colonization, Christianization. The farther they were from the first contact, the greater the likelihood that we will have textual evidence of the existence of these peoples and communities. Brothers and sisters, that is not a coincidence. Callender and Kokums also provide us with some insight as to the decline of Two-Spirit and indigenous persons among indigenous communities in native North America. Early accounts mention their frequency consistently and describe the Bardash as incredibly numerous. Over time, accounts describe the existence of these persons as increasingly rare and uncommon. So while the earliest accounts suggest a significant role for Two-Spirit and indigenous queer persons within native cultures and communities, the importance and legitimacy of this role diminished as other factors combined to discourage the assumption of this status, including the disintegration of the religious, cultural, cultic systems to which these identities were inexorably linked. The waning of this status was a complex process in which hostility and incursion of Western outsiders who were outraged by its open display and public acceptance in native communities and in ceremonial gatherings influenced indigenous understandings of sexuality and gender. Over time and with increasing exposure, Western prejudices and phobias were eventually internalized in tribal communities, as the biases of the dominant culture were absorbed by these native communities, who became increasingly reticent about the Bardashes and denied, in some cases, their former existence. A sad byproduct of the increasing colonization and Christianization of native North America is that Two-Spirit and indigenous queer persons began to disappear soon after European or American control was established. In his controversial work on the institutionalized homosexuality of the Mojave Indians, famed ethnologist and psychoanalyst George Devereux sought to provide academic audiences with a view of a rapidly disappearing Mojave sex life, quote, entirely untrammeled by Western social restraint and convention, end quote. Though this seminal article is colored by the unavoidable prejudices and assumptions of its time, 1937, institutionalized homosexuality provides us with a glimpse of Two-Spirit and indigenous queer life among the Mojave prior to the fullest encroachments of colonization and Christianization. Far from being a modern origin or resulting from Western influence, as some now claim, Devereux observed that Two-Spirit and indigenous queer persons and identities were reported by the earliest travelers in that region. Further, that the Mojave believed that there was a factor of predestination and inevitability in these persons that originated in the womb, as evidenced by the dreams of the parents, dreams being Devereux's psychoanalytic specialty. But also that Two-Spirit and indigenous queer persons and identities have been a part of native life, quoting the Mojave, ever since the world began. In the Mojave worldview, not only were these persons part of the original design of creation, Two-Spirit and indigenous queer persons were called to serve an important, sacred social function as healers, quote, from the very beginning of the world. Another important contribution of this article is Devereux's cautious descriptions and depictions of the communal ceremonies and initiation rites that emerged for those embracing these identities, rites said to have been ordered and created by their god, Mastamho. These ceremonies and their explanation detailed how Two-Spirit persons were identified as children, how these identities could be explored and tested by their kinship circles, how the Mojave community could call forth and name these identities in song and in ritual, and how those individuals were to be addressed honorifically and treated by the community after the important rites of passage took place. Devereux is careful to assert that though these ceremonies often took place, quote, as early as the age of 10 or 11, end quote, the intent was never to take the initiate by surprise or to induce a change in the initiate's personal habits, but rather that this was seen as a means of determining, testing, trying his or her true natural inclinations. It was a test and a public acknowledgement of a shift, a ceremonial, communal sanctioning of what they thought to be the inevitable. These ceremonies were not taken lightly or performed haphazardly. The community believed the effects of these ceremonies permanent. Sadly, Devereux observed that though similar practices and belief systems were operant among the Maricopa, the Northeastern and Western Yavapai, the Kokapa, the Camilla, the Yuma, by the early part of the 20th century, these ceremonies were already being abandoned or actively repressed, having not been performed or observed even several decades. But why? How? In the regulation of First Nations sexuality, sociologist Martin Cannon examines colonial efforts of making cisgendered heterosexuality compulsory in First Nation communities. Efforts Cannon identifies as being rooted in racist, patriarchal, and heterosexist ideologies that seek to marginalize and repress the broad range of gender and erotic diversity found in First Nations communities prior to European contact. Cannon proffers that Christian missionaries were determined to, quote, civilize the Indian populations by attempting to indoctrinate indigenous communities with a decidedly Christian ethos and a patriarchal family structure that even then they described as alien to the indigenous kinship circles. Cannon maintains that it was in and through this mission of conversion that same-sex, erotic, and sexual diversity was negatively evaluated and condemned. For Christian missionaries, the sexual and gender diversity of Native America was not just seen as illegitimate expressions of a, quote, savage sexuality, end quote, but as a matter of salvation for entire peoples and continents. We still hear echoes of that narrative today. What resulted was a Christianizing and colonizing impetus to eradicate all such erotic and sexual relations, and in their place establish a system of Christian morality rooted in a racist and mandatory structure of power and kinship relations that were both patriarchal and heterosexist. It was in and through the regulation of indigenous sexuality and gender identity then that the Euro-Christian missions made their first attempt toward their, quote, civilizing agenda. As you know, this civilizing agenda was unequivocally successful. By the time legal prohibitions against same-sex relations and gender non-conforming identities were enacted, and by the time tribal ceremonies honoring them were legally suppressed, many Native communities had already begun to abandon two-spirit ceremonies, forbid British relationships, and oppress indigenous queer persons and communities in the name of their newly adopted Christian faith. Through internalized oppression and lateral violence, Native communities began to police themselves, often turning brutally on indigenous queer and two-spirit persons as manifestations of everything Indians feared and hated about themselves in this new colonized, Christianized context. As Dakota, who we'll learn more about tomorrow, laments, quote, first they raped our land, then they raped our culture, then they raped and murdered our two-spirit brothers and sisters, while good Indian people stood by and watched, hiding behind their rosaries Bibles. What resulted was the near pan-tribal suppression of two-spirit and indigenous persons and identities across native North America. A once rich, diverse, vital array of sexual orientations and gender identities intrinsic to native lifeways and cultures across the North American continent was nearly eradicated and conveniently forgotten within a few generations. Nearly. Despite the seemingly insurmountable odds, two-spirit and indigenous peoples and identities survived Christianization and colonization. The interviews we will engage tomorrow are a powerful testimony as to the strength and tenacity and courage of our two-spirit and indigenous brothers, sisters, and kin in history and in modernity. But let's return briefly to this theme of incursion. At this point, thoughtful, compassionate Christians, just like you, are probably in roughly the same general ballpark, even if we may disagree on some of the particulars. We can likely agree that we know that two-spirit and indigenous persons existed in a widespread and sustained fashion prior to colonization. We can even agree that Christianization was likely the contributing factor to the near eradication of two-spirit and indigenous identities and communities in native North America. But was it an incursion? Or was it simply an inevitable byproduct of Christian evangelization at a time that was admittedly racist, patriarchal, and heterosexist? It's a fair question to ask. Could it have gone any other way? As you enter your small group conversations after here in a few moments, I'd like you to reflect on how a different missiological approach unfolded in the Philippines during a time that was, by all accounts, also equally racist and patriarchal and heterosexist. When your distant restorationist cousins in the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, now called Community of Christ, because that's the longest name for a church in human history, when they sent missionaries to the Philippines in the 1860s, they encountered, and excuse me if I mispronounce this, I apologize, the bakla. The bakla being the Tagalog word for those of a third gender, common in the Philippines. Persons who blurred the lines between male and female in the Western conception of gender identity and human sexuality. Persons who, like our two-spirit and indigenous brothers, sisters, and kin, held an honored, sacred position in Filipino society. When the RLDS missionaries encountered the bakla, rather than demonizing and actively suppressing them, they acknowledged both the bakla's honored, privileged place in Filipino society and their own limited understanding of how and why the bakla existed in this strange new place. One missionary wrote in his journal, "We turn to our scriptures and our covenants to find them. But soon we discovered that, like many people, they were absent from our divine revelations. Not evil, not savage, not even an abomination, just absent." And so the missionaries took a very different approach, no doubt inspired by their commitment to peace and their continuing revelation. They made space for the bakla and accepted them as a normative facet of their new cultural landscape, that new place in which they found themselves. To this day, the bakla are welcomed and even celebrated in Community of Christ congregations in the Philippines. In fact, it is the bakla who played a pivotal role in moving the Community of Christ Church to greater inclusion of the LGBTQI+ community globally in our lifetime. Look what God can do. Just get out of the way. Things could and should have gone differently in native North America. Amen? Evangelization and incursion are not synonymous. The doctrine of discovery is not the gospel of Jesus Christ. The doctrine of discovery is a false gospel. It is anti-Christic to the teachings of the one who we claim to follow. It must be stated unequivocally that the church was demonically complicit in the evils of colonization, and that the forced Christianization of indigenous peoples was an act of cultural violence, the effects of which are still discernible and demonstrable today. Christian history is replete with examples of how the church, in its quest for political and temporal power, has continually aligned itself with corrupt governments and incursive movements across the centuries around the globe, in an attempt to spread the good news by the sword, slaughtering anyone who would stand in the way of Christian progress. It is a bloody, abhorrent history, one that calls into question the very legitimacy of the Christian community in all its forms, and the truth and efficacy of the Christian message, all its amazing variations. It could have been different. It should have been different. It's got to be different now. You see, incursion is not a thing of the past. Our theologies, our missiological endeavors, our ways of fostering community are still infected with this incursive impulse. It is the American original sin, visited upon the generations that have followed. The doctrine of discovery is implicit dogma even now, even for those of you disciples who claim to have no dogma. You see, our westward expansion never stopped. It's only been internalized and sanitized and digitized. The frontier has changed, true, but still we push west. Still, we move ever westward to save red souls at the expense of red bodies and red communities, red cultures. My prayer for us today is that we will individually and collectively come to a place where we say no more, enough. My prayer for us today is that we will repent of the sin of incursion and move ever toward that gospel of inclusion and reconciliation that moves us ever closer to being those movements for healing and justice in a fragmented world. Thank you.